On the 23rd of April, 1968, a 14-year-old schoolboy named Roy Tutill left Kingston Grammar School at 3:30 in the afternoon, dressed in his uniform, a pink blazer with gray stripes, and set off on the journey home to the village of Brockham in Surrey. He never arrived. 3 days later, his body was found in a wooded plantation near Mickleham, and the investigation into his murder would go on to become one of the longest unsolved cases in British criminal history, a case that would not be closed until more than 3 decades later, when a routine drink-driving stop in the Midlands finally connected a name to a crime that had haunted a Surrey community since the height of the swinging 60s. Roy Tutill was known to his friends and family as Toots, a quiet, studious boy who lived with his parents, Dennis and Hilary, in Brockham Green, a small village near Dorking that, much like so many of the settlements at the center of stories like this one, prized its own sense of safety and familiarity. He enjoyed cycling and model aircraft, the kind of ordinary teenage hobbies that mark out a childhood as unremarkable in the best possible sense, a boy simply getting on with the business of growing up in a quiet corner of England. On the day he disappeared, Roy had a very specific, very ordinary reason for the choice that would ultimately cost him his life. He wanted to save the sixpence bus fare that would otherwise have carried him the final stretch of his journey home, money he was setting aside toward a new bicycle. Rather than stay on the bus all the way to Brockham, he got off partway in Chessington and did something he had apparently done many times before without incident. He began to hitchhike. It is worth pausing here to remember just how different the texture of everyday life was in Britain in 1968. Hitchhiking, particularly for teenagers making their way home from school, was a far more common and far less alarming practice than it would become in later decades. Roy was not engaging in some reckless act of teenage defiance. He was doing something that, in the world he inhabited, was simply an accepted, unremarkable way of getting from one place to another, a small act of independence and thrift that countless other schoolchildren across the country were doing on any given afternoon. That ordinary decision to save a few pence toward a bicycle by putting his thumb out at the side of the road placed him directly in the path of a stranger who would take his life. Roy was last seen in Chessington, trying to hail a passing car. A bus ticket later found in his pocket confirmed the route he had taken that day, the final, small, mundane piece of evidence marking the last steps of an otherwise unremarkable schoolboy's journey home. When he failed to arrive at the house in Wheeler's Lane where his family waited for him, his parents did what any parents would do. At 9:20 that evening, Dennis and Hilary Tutill contacted the police in Dorking to report their son missing. What followed was an urgent, wide-ranging search effort typical of the era, conducted without any of the technological tools that would later transform missing persons investigations. Officers took photographs of Roy to Tolworth and to Chessington Zoo, hoping someone might recall having seen him. They questioned bus drivers along his usual route, hoping one of them might remember a boy in a distinctive pink and gray school blazer. Local searchers combed the area around Brockham itself, checking every possible hiding place they could think of, including a search of pillboxes, the small wartime concrete defensive structures still scattered across the Surrey countryside, in case Roy had simply taken shelter somewhere nearby and become stuck or injured. The search did not end in relief. On Friday, the 26th of April, 3 days after Roy vanished, forestry workers going about their ordinary work in a plantation near a private road at Mickleham made a devastating discovery. There, in the woodland, partially covered by his own school blazer, lay the body of Roy Tutill. A post-mortem examination confirmed what investigators had feared from the moment his disappearance stretched past the first anxious night. Roy had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The murder of a 14-year-old boy on his way home from school sent shockwaves through the quiet Surrey communities of Brockham, Leatherhead, Dorking, and the surrounding villages. This was 1968, an era in which violent crime against children, while certainly not unheard of, still carried an especially acute power to disturb entire communities down to their foundations. Roy's murder became not simply a local tragedy, but a defining, unresolved wound for the area. the kind of case that lodges itself permanently in a community's collective memory precisely because it is never allowed the closure of resolution. The initial police investigation, conducted with the forensic tools and techniques available in the late 1960s, focused on the small handful of physical clues detectives had managed to gather. Central to their efforts was a description of the vehicle in which Roy had last been seen attempting to hitch a ride, a distinctive Austin Westminster car. Investigators pursued this lead with real determination, tracking down and questioning owners of similar vehicles across the region, hoping that somewhere among them was the driver who had picked Roy up that afternoon and who held the key to what had happened to him afterward. Despite this effort, the Austin-Westminster lead, promising as it initially seemed, ultimately led nowhere conclusive. The trail went cold, and as the months passed without an arrest, the investigation settled into the frustrating, indefinite limbo that so many unsolved murders eventually occupy, never officially closed, but with no active path forward for detectives to pursue. The case did not entirely fade from public consciousness in the years that followed. In 1970, 2 years after the murder, the popular television program Police 5, a long-running series that presented details of unsolved crimes to the public in the hope of jogging memories or prompting new information, featured Roy's case in one of its broadcasts. The response was significant by the standards of the time. The program generated around 140 telephone calls and 14 written letters from members of the public offering tips, memories, or theories. Yet despite this outpouring of public engagement, none of the information generated by the broadcast succeeded in identifying Roy's killer. The case slipped back into dormancy, another entry in the steadily growing catalog of unsolved British murders that stretched back years, and would, in Roy's case, eventually stretch back decades. The investigation was not entirely abandoned during the long years that followed, even if it produced no breakthrough. In 1989, more than 2 decades after the murder, a police sergeant who had worked on the original inquiry back in 1968, by then risen to the rank of Detective Chief Superintendent for Surrey and named Vince McFadden, personally interviewed a man who had remarkably admitted to the murder. This individual appeared to fit a troubling number of the details investigators had spent years trying to match. He owned the right type of car, an Austin Westminster, and he had been working as a salesman on the day in question, with records placing him at a shop directly alongside the spot where Roy had last been seen alive. It seemed, for a moment, that decades of frustration might finally be coming to an end. Scientists at the time attempted to extract usable DNA from stains found on preserved exhibits connected to the case, hoping forensic science might finally be able to confirm what this man had told detectives directly. Once again, despite the promise of this lead, the effort came to nothing, and the case remained unsolved. A further attempt was made in 1998, 3 decades after Roy's death, when detectives once more reconsidered the case in light of newly advanced DNA testing techniques, hoping that whatever remained of the physical evidence collected back in 1968 might finally yield a usable genetic profile. This renewed effort also initially met with no success, another disappointing chapter in a case that had already outlasted an entire generation of investigators. But police, as a matter of principle and practice, never formally close an unsolved murder case. And the patience of Surrey's detectives, sustained across 3 decades of dead ends, was about to be rewarded by advances in forensic science that simply had not existed when Roy Tutill first went missing. Behind the scenes, forensic scientists had continued intermittently to work with the small amount of biological material still preserved from the original 1968 investigation. Medical samples and items of Roy's clothing had been examined repeatedly over the years using whatever technique was available at the time. Early blood group testing, conducted not long after the murder, had failed to yield any satisfactory or usable results. In 1991, investigators returned to swabs taken from the victim and carried out what was known as single-locus profiling on his trousers, an early form of DNA analysis. That specific technique again failed to produce a usable result, but crucially, semen stain samples extracted during this process were carefully preserved and placed in a freezer, held in reserve for whatever future forensic advances might one day make them useful. That patience paid off in 1996 when a more advanced method known as SGM profiling, a refined form of DNA analysis that had simply not existed decades earlier, was applied to an extract taken from one of the preserved medical swabs. This time, the technique succeeded where every previous attempt had failed. A usable DNA profile was finally obtained from the genetic material left behind by Roy's killer nearly 3 decades earlier, and that profile was loaded into the newly established National DNA Database, a national system designed to compare crime scene DNA against profiles taken from individuals arrested or convicted of other offenses across the country. For several more years, that DNA profile sat within the database, a genetic fingerprint of a killer with no name attached to it, waiting for a match that could come from anywhere, at any time, whenever the right individual happened to be arrested for any offense serious enough to warrant a DNA sample being taken. The wait, remarkably, would not be for a violent crime or another act of abuse that finally brought the killer back into contact with police. It would be for something almost absurdly mundane by comparison. In September of 1999, more than 30 years after Roy Tutill's murder, a man was stopped by police in Birmingham on suspicion of drink driving. As was standard procedure, a DNA sample was taken from him in connection with that comparatively minor offense. In the year 2000, that sample was run against the National DNA Database, and a match came back. The genetic profile obtained from that routine drink driving stop corresponded exactly to the DNA profile that had been sitting, unmatched, in the system since 1996, extracted from evidence connected to the murder of a 14-year-old schoolboy in 1968. The man's name was Brian Lunn Field. The discovery of this match opened up an entirely new chapter in the investigation, one that revealed just how completely Brian Field had managed to disappear from any meaningful official scrutiny in the decades following Roy's murder. Detectives working to track him down found that Field had, by the time of the DNA match, been living largely off the radar for many years, working as a gardener and, remarkably, not paying any taxes, a life conducted quietly and anonymously, seemingly designed to avoid drawing any official attention whatsoever. Investigators discovered that Field had last been definitively heard of sometime in the 1980s, and locating him in the present day required careful, patient surveillance work once his approximate location in Birmingham had been established through the drink-driving arrest. What detectives uncovered about Brian Field's history in the years between Roy's murder and his eventual capture painted a deeply disturbing picture of a man whose violent and predatory tendencies had not been confined to a single crime in 1968. Field's criminal record, pieced together across decades and multiple jurisdictions, included a fine issued in 1969, the year immediately following Roy's murder, for gross indecency. It included an assault committed in Aberdeen during the 1970s, and it included 2 separate prison sentences handed down during the 1980s, each of 4 years, for 2 counts of unlawful sex with underage boys, alongside charges of falsely imprisoning his victims. Taken together, this record revealed a pattern stretching across more than 2 decades, a man who had continued to offend against children and young people again and again, moving between locations, evading any conclusive connection to the original, far more serious crime that had first brought him into contact with a teenage victim back in 1968. Once his identity had been confirmed and his location established, Surrey police moved to bring Brian Field into custody. On the 22nd of February 2001, he was arrested at his home in Solihull, in the West Midlands, more than 32 years after Roy Tutill had been murdered. He was charged with murder, rape, and abduction in connection with the killing of the 14-year-old schoolboy whose case had haunted Surrey detectives across 3 separate generations of investigators. When the case reached its legal conclusion later that year, Brian Field, by then 65 years old, pleaded guilty to the murder of Roy Tutill. Notably, he did not plead guilty to the charge of sexual assault, maintaining, even at this final stage, some measure of denial regarding the full scope of what he had done to his victim, despite the DNA and forensic evidence that had already conclusively linked him to the crime. On the 15th of November 2001, Brian Field was sentenced to life imprisonment. One of the most quietly devastating details to emerge from the conclusion of this decades-long case was the fact that Roy's parents, Dennis and Hillary Tutill, did not live to see the man responsible for their son's murder finally brought to justice. They had spent the remainder of their own lives carrying the unresolved grief of a murdered child whose killer walked free. And they died without ever learning his name, without ever hearing a courtroom pronounce a sentence, without ever receiving the small, imperfect measure of closure that a conviction can sometimes provide to families who have waited so long for an answer. It stands as one of the starkest illustrations of just how much is lost when a case remains unsolved for decades. Not simply the passage of time itself, but the loss of the very people who most deserved to witness whatever justice eventually arrived. The conviction of Brian Field in 2001 was at the time recognized as the oldest cold case ever solved in the United Kingdom. A case that had waited 33 years for advances in forensic DNA technology to finally catch up with a killer who had, in the meantime, continued to move through the world largely unchecked, accumulating further convictions for offenses against children even as the original murder that should have seen him imprisoned decades earlier remained formally unsolved. It would hold that particular distinction as Britain's oldest solved cold case until 2012, when a separate investigation finally secured the conviction of David Burgess for the 1966 murder of Yolande Waddington, a case that had, by then, waited even longer for resolution. Following Field's conviction, police did not simply close the file and move on. Recognizing the disturbing pattern that had emerged from his criminal record, investigators began examining a number of other unsolved cases involving missing or murdered children and young people, seeking to establish whether any of them might also be connected to Brian Field. Among the cases that came under this renewed scrutiny was the disappearance of 15-year-old Mark Billington, who had gone missing from his home in Yardley, Birmingham in September of 1984, and whose body was later found in Meriden, near Coventry, 2 months after he vanished. Despite the resources devoted to exploring a possible connection between Field and this case, and despite several arrests made in the course of that renewed investigation, no charges were ever ultimately brought in relation to Mark Billington's death, leaving that particular case, unlike Roy Tutill's, still formally unresolved. Brian Field spent the remainder of his life in prison, having been convicted at an age when many men are already well into retirement, a life sentence handed down for a crime he had first committed as a young man decades earlier. He remained in custody for nearly 2 more decades following his conviction, growing old behind bars in a way that Roy Tutill himself never had the chance to do. Field ultimately died in custody at Himp Full Sutton in Yorkshire at the age of 87, having spent his final years as an elderly inmate serving out a sentence for a murder committed when the victim was still, and would always remain, only 14 years old. What makes the case of Roy Tutill such a profoundly significant chapter in the history of British criminal investigation is not simply the brutality of the crime itself, tragic and shocking as that remains, but the extraordinary length of time across which the case was kept alive by investigators who refused to allow it to be forgotten. 3 separate generations of detectives, working across 3 decades, each contributed something to the eventual resolution of this case. The original 1968 team who gathered the first crucial samples and pursued the Austin-Westminster lead as far as it would go. The officers of the late 1980s and 1990s who returned to those preserved samples again and again, applying whatever new forensic technique had become available, patiently waiting for science to catch up with the evidence they had carefully protected. And finally, the investigators of 2000 and 2001, who were handed the improbable gift of a routine drink-driving arrest that unknowingly delivered them the exact genetic match they had been waiting more than 30 years to find. This case also stands as one of the clearest illustrations of how the advent of national DNA databases fundamentally transformed the landscape of criminal investigation in Britain. Before such systems existed, a genetic profile extracted from decades-old evidence was, in a very real sense, a dead end unless investigators already had a specific suspect in mind to compare it against. The creation of a national database changed that equation entirely, allowing a profile connected to a 30-year-old unsolved murder to sit quietly in a vast digital repository until an entirely unrelated minor offense committed by the very same individual brought his own DNA into the system and triggered a match that no amount of traditional detective work alone could ever have produced. It is a sobering thought that Brian Field's eventual capture depended, in the end, not on some dramatic breakthrough in the original murder investigation, but on the almost banal chance that he happened to be pulled over for drink driving more than 3 decades after he had killed a schoolboy on a quiet Surrey road. The village of Brockham and the wider communities of Leatherhead, Dorking, and Chessington that were all touched in some way by Roy Tutill's disappearance and murder carried the weight of this unresolved case for far longer than most communities are ever asked to endure. For 33 years, an entire region lived with the knowledge that a child had been murdered in their midst, and that whoever was responsible remained free, unidentified, and potentially still living among them or nearby. That particular sustained uncertainty, the not knowing whether a killer has moved on, been caught for some other crime elsewhere, or is still quietly present in the community, represents its own distinct and lasting form of collective trauma, one that resolution, however delayed, only partially addresses. Roy Tutill's story endures today not simply as a historical curiosity about the earliest days of forensic DNA technology, but as a memorial to a real 14-year-old boy whose ordinary, thrifty decision to save a few pence toward a new bicycle placed him, entirely by chance, in the path of a predator who had already begun a pattern of offending against children that would continue, largely unchecked, for decades afterward. He was, by every account that survives him, an unremarkable, likable boy engaged in unremarkable, likable pursuits, cycling, building model aircraft, making his own way home from school exactly as countless other schoolboys of his era did every single day. That he became, instead, the center of one of the longest-running unsolved murder investigations in British history is a testament not to anything he did, but to the sheer arbitrary cruelty of encountering the wrong stranger on an ordinary spring afternoon in 1968, and to the extraordinary patience of the investigators who spent more than 30 years refusing to let his case or his memory simply fade away. There is a particular quality to cases like this one that sets them apart from murders solved within days or weeks of their commission, and it has to do with the strange, layered relationship between memory, time, and justice. When Roy Tutill went missing in April of 1968, the investigators who first searched the pillboxes around Brockham and questioned bus drivers along his route were working entirely within the world as it existed at that moment. No genetic fingerprinting. No national databases, no way of extracting a killer's identity from a stain of biological evidence beyond matching it to a blood type shared by millions of other people. The tools available to them were fundamentally limited by the era in which they worked, and yet those same investigators, understanding perhaps instinctively that science does not stand still, made the decision to preserve what evidence they could, freezing samples that held no immediate value but that might, one day, decades into the future, finally speak. That decision, made by officers who could not have known whether it would ever bear fruit, and who in many cases would not live to see whether it eventually did, represents one of the quieter forms of diligence embedded within long-running criminal investigations. It is easy, looking back from the present day, to focus on the dramatic moment of the DNA match. The discovery in the year 2000 that finally connected Brian Field's genetic profile to evidence sitting in cold storage since the 1960s. But that moment of resolution was only possible because of a much longer chain of quiet, unglamorous work stretching back across 3 decades. Officers filing away samples they could not yet analyze. Scientists returning to those same samples again and again as each new forensic technique became available, and a police force that, even after repeated failures and dead ends, refused to formally close the file on a murdered schoolboy. It is also worth considering what this case reveals about the particular vulnerability of children and teenagers in the Britain of the late 1960s. A period in which practices like hitchhiking, walking long distances alone, and accepting lifts from strangers were woven into the fabric of everyday life in a way that later generations would find difficult to imagine. Roy Tutill was not behaving recklessly by the standards of his own time. He was behaving exactly as countless other schoolchildren across the country behaved every single day, treating a stranger's car as an unremarkable, practical way of covering the final stretch of a long journey home. His murder and the wider cultural shift in attitudes toward child safety that gradually followed cases like his across the ensuing decades forms part of a broader story about how British society slowly came to recognize dangers that had, for years, gone largely unacknowledged and unaddressed. The pattern of offending that investigators eventually uncovered in Brian Field's history after his arrest adds a further, deeply unsettling dimension to this case. Here was a man who, having committed a murder in 1968 that went entirely undetected, went on to accumulate further convictions across the following decades. A fine for gross indecency within a year of killing Roy, an assault committed in Scotland during the 1970s, and two separate lengthy prison sentences in the 1980s for offenses against underage boys. Each of these later offenses represented an opportunity, in theory, for the full scope of Field's history to be uncovered, for some connection to be drawn between the man being sentenced for these later crimes and the still unsolved murder of a schoolboy from Surrey years earlier. That no such connection was made until the D-Na match of the year 2000 speaks to just how disconnected criminal record-keeping and forensic capability remained across different decades and different police jurisdictions, allowing a man with an established, repeated pattern of offending against children to continue moving largely unchecked for the better part of 30 years. This raises an uncomfortable but important question that cases like this one force communities and investigators alike to confront. How many opportunities exist across the lifetime of a repeat offender to intervene before the worst possible outcome occurs? And how many of those opportunities are missed not through negligence exactly, but through the simple limitations of the systems and technologies available at any given moment in history? Brian Field's decades of continued offending after Roy Tutill's murder suggest that whatever compulsion drove him to kill in 1968 did not resolve itself or fade with time. It persisted, manifesting again and again in different forms, against different victims, in different parts of the country for years after the crime that should, in a better world, have seen him identified and removed from society entirely. The eventual identification of Brian Field through nothing more dramatic than a routine drink-driving stop carries its own kind of dark irony. Here was a man whose original crime had evaded detection despite an extensive contemporary investigation, despite a national television appeal that generated well over 100 public responses, despite repeated attempts across multiple decades to extract usable forensic evidence from preserved samples, and despite at least one direct confession made to a senior detective in 1989 that ultimately could not be corroborated with the science available at the time. In the end, it was not any of these substantial, deliberate investigative efforts that finally closed the net around him, but an entirely unrelated, minor traffic offense, the kind of thing that happens to thousands of people every year without any deeper significance attached to it. For Brian Field, that minor offense proved to be the single thread that, once pulled, unraveled more than 3 decades of successfully concealed guilt. For the wider public, the resolution of the Roy Tutill case in 2001 offered a powerful, if bittersweet, demonstration of how far forensic science had traveled since the late 1960s, and a reminder that even the coldest of cold cases need never be considered permanently closed. Surrey Police's willingness to return to this case repeatedly across 3 decades, applying each new generation of forensic technique as it became available, stands as a testament to institutional patience and to a fundamental refusal to accept that time alone should be allowed to shield a killer from justice. That patience was, in the most literal sense, decades in the making, spanning changes in police leadership, changes in forensic technology, and changes in the very structure of how criminal evidence could be stored, analyzed, and cross-referenced against a growing national database of genetic profiles. And yet, For all that this case represents a genuine triumph of dogged persistence and scientific advancement, it remains at its heart the story of a 14-year-old boy who never came home from school on an ordinary spring afternoon in 1968, whose parents spent the rest of their own lives waiting for an answer that arrived only after they themselves had died, and whose name, Roy Tutill, known affectionately to his friends simply as Toots, deserves to be remembered not primarily for the extraordinary length of the investigation his murder eventually prompted, but for the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely innocent boy he was before a stranger in an Austin Westminster car changed the course of his family's history forever. 33 years is an extraordinarily long time for any family to wait for justice, and the fact that Dennis and Hillary Tutill did not live to see that justice finally delivered stands as one of the most quietly heartbreaking details in the entire history of British unsolved crime. A reminder that even when the system eventually gets it right, it can still arrive far too late for the people who needed it most. Roy Tutill's case is remembered today not only as a landmark in the history of forensic science, but as a quiet reminder to every community that a case left unsolved is never truly abandoned so long as someone continues to ask the question of what happened and who was responsible. For 33 years, that question hung unanswered over Brockham and the villages around it, until science, patience, and a small stroke of chance finally gave it an answer.